look together to some selected passages from the Gospels of Matthew, John, and Mark. And in those days, John the Baptist came preaching in the wilderness of Judea and saying, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven has come near." And John's clothes were made of camel's hair, and he had a leather belt around his waist, and his food was locusts and wild honey. And then Jesus came from Galilee to the Jordan to be baptized by John. But John tried to deter him, saying, "I need to be baptized by you, and do you come to me?" And Jesus replied, "Let it be so now. It is proper for us to do this to fulfill all righteousness." Then John consented, and as soon as Jesus was baptized, he went up out of the water. And at that moment, heaven was opened, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on him. And a voice from heaven said, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased." On the third day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee, and Jesus' mother was there. And Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. And when the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." "Woman, why do you involve me?" Jesus replied. "My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. And Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." So they filled them to the brim. And then he told them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet." They did so. And the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, "Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now." What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. They went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath had come, Jesus went into the synagogue and began to teach. The people were amazed at his teaching because he taught them as one who had authority and not as the teachers of the law. Just then a man in their synagogue who was possessed by an evil spirit cried out, "What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." "Be quiet," said Jesus sternly. "Come out of him." The impure spirit shook the man violently and came out of him with a shriek. And the people were all so amazed that they asked each other, "What is this? A new teaching and with authority. He even gives orders to impure spirits, and they obey him." News about him spread quickly over the whole region of Galilee. Once again, Jesus went out beside the lake. A large crowd came to him, and he began to teach them. And as he walked along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," Jesus told him. And Levi got up and followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were eating with him and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. And when the teachers of the law, who were Pharisees, saw him eating with the sinners and tax collectors, they asked his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" And upon hearing this, Jesus said to them, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." How about we begin today with a couple of words that we're hearing more and more about. And the words are creative destruction. Seems a guy named Joseph Schumpeter first came up with this phrase back about 75 years ago in the early 40s. It was a way to describe the act of a newly created thing destroying its predecessor. Let's think about the field of transportation, for instance. Along comes the onset of the steam-powered locomotive, railways. When that came along, we began to see the demise of jobs that related to horses and mules. If you were a blacksmith, if you were a saddle maker, if you ran a feed mill, then along comes the steam-powered locomotive, and now people could travel by train. They could do their farm work with steam, and as a result, they no longer needed you. Your services were no longer required. Then along comes the advance of the automobile, and that not only creatively destroyed any vestige of the remaining horse and buggy days, but also it overtook the train industry. And today, creative destruction is an everyday occurrence in industries that literally thrive upon innovation. For example, the music industry, it watch sales of CDs literally plummet as a result of the onset of people downloading their music now for free. Same is true in the onset of the smartphone. Several years ago, it comes along. It all but stifles the market for not only regular cell phones, but things like PDAs and MP3 players and point-and-click cameras and wristwatches. I'm still kind of old school. Calculators, voice recorders, on and on. Don't need them anymore. Creative destruction. We see it in fields like banking and healthcare and the automobile industry. The examples go on and on and on. Well, as we head into chapter 23 of our story for today, we're going to see that Jesus' mission is one, literally, of creative destruction. Because you see, in each of the realms I just mentioned, banking, healthcare, automobiles, they reach such a crisis point economically that these industries have had the necessity of rethinking themselves from the ground floor up. No one of the previous assumptions that you assume were the way that you did things before, the way you operated, could be taken for granted. It became back to the drawing board as they reinvented the way that things worked. And so as we begin to watch Jesus' ministry unfold today, we're going to see a lot of the same thing, because he also starts with this blank sort of slate. He reinvents the notion of who and what Israel's Messiah was supposed to look like. He takes this blank palette and he starts all over again. We get to see today, folks, two critical missions that Jesus has. The first, we've just mentioned, he shatters all of the previous notions of Israel's long-awaited Messiah. But then secondly today, we're going to see how he authenticates his dominion and his authority over all the other competing forces. And folks, as we leave the celebration of Jesus' birth behind from last week, I want us today to look at these two mission objectives of Jesus. And to start out with, it appears that everyone in Jesus' day was looking in the wrong direction. Israel, they had been anticipating for ages the coming of this Messiah, this political leader, this military ruler. He was this revolutionary who was supposed to come and restore power and prominence, as in the days of Solomon. For nearly a century, Rome had increasingly taken over occupation of Judea. And so by the time the Jesus ministry comes along, the Jews, they had experienced so much hardship under Roman occupation that the thought of this revolutionary leader who would come riding in on his white charger and save the day was woven into the very fabric of their culture. This was the very embodiment of what they thought the Messiah was supposed to be. And yet, as we're about to discover, Jesus, he comes along, and his mission is so radically different from all of their past expectations. It was so counterintuitive. Jesus, he finds, sort of like the executives did at a company like Hallmark, that they had to effectively start all over again by creatively destroying all of these false expectations. He had to shatter and then recast his image all over again. But secondly, Jesus also had to sort of validate this new image that he was unveiling. He had to do it by demonstrating his power over all other obstacles. In other words, if people were really going to buy into this new image of the Messiah that he was building, then he had to back it up. He had to back up his claims with proof that they were really true. So as we go through today the events that lead up to and include Jesus' early ministry that we read about just a moment ago, I want you to see everything within these two lenses. Let's watch as simultaneously Jesus sort of obtains these two goals. He authenticates, he shatters. And let's begin by noticing a guy that we read about named John the Baptist. John was Jesus' cousin. And I mean, talk about a guy who was sort of the epitome of creative destruction. As you recall, as we finished last week, the last pages a few weeks ago of the Old Testament, the final book of the Old Testament was the book of Malachi. And in Malachi, we heard the prophet Malachi share with us these words. I will send my messenger who will prepare the way before me. And then suddenly the Lord you are seeking will come to his temple. The messenger of the covenant whom you desire will come, says the Lord Almighty. And if people had expectations about the Messiah, then you can assume that they also had expectations about his forerunner. And according to all of the Gospels, his messenger, his forerunner, was John the Baptist. And John was a guy who certainly, we could say, marched to a different drummer. He lacked a certain sense of tact. His fashion sense, it was all out of style, camel hair suits. They were not only sort of scratchy, but they carried a certain amount of fleas. At dinner parties, not only was his wardrobe out of touch with the fashion dress code, but he tended to bring his own hors d'oeuvres, locusts, wild honey. Everyone was asking, where did they get this guy? Why this guy? John, he had a good answer, and he said, the reason why I came baptizing with water is so that God's upper story could finally now be revealed. In other words, John was saying, hey guys, I'm a pointer. I point to the one that we've all been waiting for. And sure, when you think about it, if you were going to pick a beacon to point to the Messiah, then wouldn't you want one that was pretty conspicuous? John was sort of hard to ignore. He was eccentric as all get out. Maybe you saw last spring over in Holland the guy that was dressed up in a Statue of Liberty outfit doing calisthenics, and he was out there doing this on a street corner to advertise a tax preparation business. Well, that's sort of John's role. And guess what? For all practical intents and purposes, folks, that's what you and I are called to be. We're sort of like a signal flare, a flashing yellow light, a pointer that signals to the presence of Jesus. Jesus Whenever you and I come into a room, Jesus comes into the room with us. And if we are the body of Christ, then when you and I enter a room, it's as if Jesus just entered that room. Well, John the Baptist's mission was to never fail to point to Jesus. And John made this wonderful analogy to prove his point. He called Jesus the bridegroom. And if Jesus is the bridegroom, who's his bride? The church. We are his bride. And therefore, what does that make John? John was the best man of the bridegroom. Wouldn't it sort of be silly at a wedding for the best man to try to steal the spotlight and make it all about himself? Sure, of course. It'd be absurd because it's the bridegroom's big day. He's the one the best man is supposed to be pointing to and saying, hey, everybody, look at him. Hey, everybody, don't look at me. So it's one thing that John never fails to do in his mission. It's job number one. He points to Jesus. You see this dude? He's the one, not me. I'm just his water boy. Jesus, he's the star. And just like with John, folks, that's our mission. When you walk into a room, Jesus walks in with you. So, is your life pointing to him? Or is it pointing to yourself? Well, next we get to witness Jesus' first miracle. Last weekend I was doing a wedding, and at the reception I was asked to pray over the food. And so as I prayed, I mentioned that Jesus' first miracle was about turning water into wine at a wedding. And to tell you the truth, if my publicist, as the Messiah, was planning this big event to kick off my ministry, then turning water into wine, it wouldn't be it. Because on a scale of 1 to 10, folks, it certainly wasn't a very flashy first miracle. I mean, you'd think that the guy would have picked a more showy display than one that just sort of elicited a golf clap. But instead, this is a miracle that's sort of behind the scenes. How did that happen? Why was that? Well, my guess is it's part of Jesus' whole sort of shattering motif we've been talking about. Right out of the gate, this miracle. It was Jesus' first attempt to recast the Messiah, not as this political animal, but as the gracious, eternal bridegroom of his bride, the church. The one who provides the wine at the reception. The one who takes care of us. And you know what? I believe that this miracle, it was a significant symbol right out of the gate from the very beginning of the kind of role that Jesus will play at the marriage feast of the Lamb someday when he gathers his church, us, his bride, unto himself once again. Yeah, Jesus is recasting himself as the husband and provider for his church. He does it by turning water into wine. Friends, the next two events in Jesus' ministry are significant because they happen back to back. First, Jesus, he's visiting Jerusalem. He receives this unexpected visit in the middle of the night from this expert in the law. He's a religious elite. He's a well-educated Pharisee. And his name is Nicodemus. You see, Pharisees, they were Jewish leaders. They interpreted the religious laws for the Jews in their day, but they were also quick to judge anyone who violated these laws. And today, folks, we might sort of describe people like the Pharisees as kind of legalistic. They were more concerned about the rules than they were a relationship with God. So it's not surprising that most of the Pharisees were sort of threatened by Jesus and his message, because he didn't fit into their nice and neat little rule books. And yet this particular Pharisee, Nicodemus, he notices that there's something different about Jesus, that he had to be from God or he wouldn't be able to do the kind of miracles he was doing. Yet we notice that Nicodemus is fearful of his other fellow brother Pharisees. And so he doesn't want to appear to be consorting with the enemy, so he comes to Jesus by night. And Jesus and Nicodemus, they strike up this conversation in which Jesus reveals to Nicodemus God's upper story plan for how he's going to restore his relationship with him. This whole plan that we've been talking about since the beginning of the story. He says to him, Nicodemus, do you want to be part of this new thing that God's doing to get us all back? Then you're going to have to be born again. Born again, Nicodemus says. You mean I got to go back in my mother's womb and I've got to come back out again? He's sort of gobsmacked by Jesus' words. Well, Jesus' upper story point is believe in me. Believe in me, Nicodemus, and you're going to have this spiritual awakening. Yeah, blessed is the one who can look past all of the unexpectedness of a non-political Messiah and simply believe who I am. And then to even take it a step further, Jesus, he offers perhaps the clearest declaration of who he is and why he came in the words of John 3:16. Say these words with me. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him shall not perish, but will have everlasting life. And yeah, this statement, it's likely the most memorized verse in all of the Bible. It describes in the simplest terms possible the literal intersection, folks, between our lower stories and God's upper story. Yeah, you and I, we live down here in all the messiness of this life. It's limited to what we can see and what we can experience firsthand, including what appears to be the final stop, death. And yet Jesus, who was up there, he put on flesh and he came down to defeat death so that you and I could spend eternity with him. Just as we sort of learned as we plowed through all 21 of those chapters in the Old Testament. Now we don't have to slaughter and sacrifice animals anymore. And that was only a temporary fix. We don't have to try harder to be good because that'll never work. We've already learned that we or what we do isn't the final solution to our whole sin problem. All we have to do is believe. And folks, for a Pharisee like Nicodemus, this must have just blown his mind. Jesus, he breaks all of the previous preconceptions, doesn't he? And yet Nicodemus, like a lot of us, haven't we been led to believe that it's all about following the rules? That's how we get to heaven, by being good. And yet isn't that a false picture of God? A picture that's caused a lot of folks to stay as far away from God as they possibly can. Sure, how many of us have this image of God as sort of this stern old guy, and he waves this long list of rules around in our faces. He keeps track of all of the rules that we've broken so he can bust our chops over some minor indiscretion. And yet he tells Nicodemus, just believe. And folks, the very next conversation that Jesus has, it couldn't have been more different. It wasn't at night with this scholar like Nicodemus. It's in the daytime. It's in a place that was as far away from what any self-respecting Jew would ever go to, a place called Samaria. There in Samaria are the Samaritans, half Jew, half Gentile, hated, despised by both sides. And yet, where does Jesus take his good, kosher, Jewish disciples, but straight into the heart of Samaria? And now Jesus moves from this esteemed Pharisee to this half-breed prostitute in a foreign land. And this time, instead of talking about being born again, he talks about living water. He meets this Samaritan woman at this well. And literally there's 3 strikes against this woman and Jesus ever even talking. First of all, she's a Samaritan and Jesus is a Jew. And Jews and Samaritans didn't talk. Strike 1. It was like oil and water. They just didn't mix. They hated each other. Number 2, Jesus was a Jewish male. And she was a stranger, a woman. A Jewish male and a strange woman that he didn't know. They never would have talked, let alone a Samaritan woman. Strike number 2. Strike number 3, Jesus is a Jewish rabbi. And she's a woman of the streets. They simply would not have talked. And yet, despite all of these lower story impossibilities that we spoke of last week, there comes in her earthly minutes an eternal moments. A Jewish rabbi speaks to her and tells her that she can have this living water. And this woman who had never been accepted or shown kindness by anyone, Jesus reveals to her that he knows about every sordid detail of her life, that she's had 5 husbands and she's now sleeping with the 6th guy, yet still he totally accepts her. And this absolutely blows her away. Where can I get some of this living water, she asks. And Jesus says, I am this living water. Come and drink. And she does. She believes. And so she runs back into town and she gets all of her other sinner, marginalized friends, and she brings them out and they have a revival. And they get saved too. Folks, these 2 consecutive events right out of the gate, they clearly shatter all of the previous preconceptions of the superstar Messiah. Jesus could not have bookended 2 more sequential conversations whose audiences were different. Jesus is deconstructing the whole Messiah image by demonstrating that he is the Lord and the Savior of all. The aristocracy and the riffraff, males and females, Gentiles and Jews, Democrats and Republicans, if you can believe in that, all you have to do is but believe. Jesus wastes absolutely no time in confounding all of our expectations. To Nicodemus, he says that all that he really needs is faith. No extra added ingredients required. To the Samaritan woman, he says, no, you may not be a Jew, but you can be one of God's children too. And all you have to do is believe. Two very different conversations, but one essential message. Two upper story meetings that intersect with two very different individuals down in their lower stories that blow away all of their previous conceptions about the Messiah. And folks, as usual, C.S. Lewis has the perfect benediction for our study today. For he says in his book, A Grief Observed, my ideas of God keep getting shattered again and again. In fact, he shatters it himself. For Jesus, the breaker and destroyer of all images, is the supreme example. He leaves all previous ideas of the Messiah in ruins. Friends, as we finally arrive after 23 chapters at Jesus' ministry, whether your preconceptions about who and what Jesus is, whatever they are, he comes, he knocks them down. He refuses to be pigeonholed or put into a box. He's the breaker and destroyer of all of our preconceived pet images about who we think he's supposed to be. And all because he desires to come just as he is. No ups, no extras. All we have to do is believe. Would you pray with me? Jesus, whatever our preconceptions about who you are might be, come. And if they need to be, shatter them, just as you did when you first came, that we might know you as you desire to be known, that we might believe that you are our Messiah, the Son of the living God, who has come to save us.